Okay, can everybody hear?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
All right, so let us begin. Welcome everybody for the share tonight.
Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so we're in the middle of discussing the din of Reish Lakish, which is the cornerstone of Dinei Shtaros, really. So again, let's go back to the background just for a minute and pick up, where we left off, which was examining the range of what Reish Lakish actually says. So the background is as follows. The Mishnah in Gittin, beginning, as we've been discussing, says that a maybe get Medina Sayam, that if a person brings a get from Chutz La'aretz, from the diaspora to Eretz Yisrael, Tzarech Lomar, he has to say, b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta, that the shliach, the agent who brings the bill of divorce to this fellow's wife, he has to, when he hands over the document, he has to also proclaim that he was present b'fanei nechtam when this get was written and when it was signed. So the question is, why? There are really two questions. What's the point behind that? And if we can explain what the point is, why is it enough that one witness would accomplish the goal of whatever the goal is? So what is the goal? So the Gemara says in the base of a base that there's a machlokas, that Rabbi is of the opinion that the goal is that the concern is that in Chutz La'aretz and the diaspora, they weren't as well versed as they should be in the halachic requirements of a get. And maybe in particular, they weren't aware, about the requirement of lishma. Lishma means that the get is written l'shem ha'ish, l'shem ha'isha. It's not a generic, factory, rendered, mass-produced document that you just, fill in the blanks.
It's a customized get.
It's a customized get. That's a great way of saying it. So the concern was that in Chutz La'aretz, they weren't as careful about that. And therefore, the shliach has to declare b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta. Rava, on the other hand, gives a different explanation. Rava says, listen, there's always a possibility, in a transaction that there'll be some sort of an appeal, some sort of a challenge to the legality or the validity of a contract. And the concern is that if people are coming, if the parties, are distant, if the get was created in Chutz La'aretz and it's being given in Eretz Yisrael, that if there is some sort of a challenge to come, that there won't be proper access to, to the verification, procedure of this contract. Because at that time, or, I guess predictably, maybe also in other times, between borders, there can be
Different jurisdictions.
Different jurisdictions. It's not always so easy, communications-wise, travel-wise, and therefore, when the get was coming from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, the thinking was, let's nip it in the bud, meaning let's get this document validated before, just in case there will be a challenge. So they midrabanan, they said you can't use the get until it is validated, and the way to validate it is for the shliach to say b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta. So then the Gemara, and you have this in your Marmakom as well. The Gemara says, well, then, if the purpose is to validate or authenticate the signatures of the get to show that the Eidim are real, then why don't you need two witnesses? After all, don't you need two witnesses? Do this in Kol Torah Kula. The Torah says, Al Pishnayim O Shlosha Eidim Yakum Davar. You need two or three witnesses. And as we know, you go to a wedding, you have to have two witnesses. There's a court case about a monetary dispute. In Beis Din, you need two witnesses. So why is it that you can, get away with one witness in this particular case? So that's the Gemara's question. If you look here on Gimel Amud Aleph or in the Marmakomos, the Rava Damar Lefi She'ein Eidim Mitzuim L'Kaimo, it's on Gimel Amud Aleph. It's 7 lines down from the top of the page. If you have it. Well, Rava Damar Lefi She'ein Eidim Mitzuim L'Kaimo, according to Rava, who says that the problem is that we're worried that the Eidim will not be present to authenticate this document. Liboy Trey, shouldn't you require 2 witnesses? Because this isn't the only transaction, where there's a discussion about validating or authenticating. Any contract, that could be a real estate deal, it could be a loan contract, right? There could be a kiddushin. Anytime you use a contract, the question of potential forgery, and therefore the question of a potential appeal or challenge, is always there. And normally, when there is a challenge, what we do is we go to we try to find the witnesses. If we can't find the witnesses, we do we go to a handwriting expert, and in the presence of dayanim, and that's called a henpek. They authorize or they verify the signatures. But whatever the edus that is required to establish that a document is valid typically requires 2 people, like any other edus. Why here is 1 enough?
Is Rava's view exclusive of Rava's? In other words, does Rava believe that they do know Lishma in Chutz La'aretz, that they are observant of Din and Lishma? Or is he also say that they're not, but that's not the problem?
So that's not so clear. I mean, it sounds like he thinks it's not a problem, because even in the end, even Rabbi ends up agreeing that it's a very remote problem. Meaning,
so Rabbi has no problems in Chutz La'aretz mehodu at kush. In other words, Rabbi is concerned about the fact that the people, you won't find the Edom, right?
Yeah.
So what did he do in Chutz La'aretz and on Achashverosh when you had to
right,
hold?
so if there are in the psak, it'd be wherever there are difficulties of communication or travel, between areas, there would be this problem.
Because if we held that he holds like Rabbi also, then it wouldn't be a problem in Chutz La'aretz. It means that but if we hold that he thinks that they do keep the Shema of Chutz La'aretz, then you would have, by Rava, then you would have to say that where's the measurement? Where does it end?
Right. It sounds like Rava is not worried about Lishma. It sounds like Rava.
So what's the metric in this?
Say again?
What's the metric? What's the distance? What's the
right? So the paradigm is between Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael during this time period, where it was known that there were different governments, and that the ability to cross the borders, was a problem. Some of the poskim say, that you would alter that, or you would apply, that lekula and chumrah according to the realities. If you lived in an era where there was no problem of communication, you wouldn't need b'fanei. If you lived in an era where even in Eretz Yisrael,
even 50 years ago,
Eretz Yisrael, there was a breakdown.
50 years ago, if a guy moved to California, I never saw him again.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a joke that when the guy wanted to disappear, he moved to California.
Right. So, but basically, it's whatever it is. They might be a little more machmir as a low plug, but it is whatever it is. Meaning, we'll see in a moment that either whether you hold like Rabba on Lishma, or whether you hold like Rava, Edom Mitzuim L'Kaimo, it ends up being a smaller problem than we thought. That's going to be part of the answer to the Gemara. So, because that is the case, it's really a reflection of having high standards, and trying to close, loopholes more than it is like a very, serious problem. But, even in these areas which are very sensitive, namely whether a marriage has really been terminated or not, we are very, very stringent in in establishing, that there are no obstructions for her to move on with her life. So, in the end of the day, in both cases, we're saying the problem is not a doraisa problem, and the problem isn't a very frequent one. But the fact that it occasionally, remotely, can be an issue, is good enough, to require an enactment. Now, how would you apply that enactment when the facts on the ground change? Like there are open borders, open communication, you'd probably be more mako. But that doesn't. We live in a world now.
Not a low plug.
What?
It's not a low plug.
So it's probably a low plug for a certain period, but it's no longer Bavel in Eretz Yisrael, that's for sure. And again, you'd think that like as history moves forward, that that the idea of access and open borders and all these kind of things,
No, we had it recently under the Soviet Union.
Or look what's going on now.
You couldn't communicate with them.
Right, and look at what's happening now. And there's more strife, and borders are more tense than ever. Who would have thought that 15 years ago? So that sometimes we leave low plugs in place for that reason. Either way, the Gemara says, how can you get away with one witness? The Gemara says, the Gemara says, because one witness sometimes works. Says the Gemara, we do have a rule that says that a single witness, not two,
but not by riots,
is sufficient in matters like kashrus. Like somebody says, this sandwich, which we're not sure whether it's a kosher sandwich or a non-kosher sandwich. So the Eid Echad can say it's a kosher sandwich or a non-kosher sandwich.
That's why we can eat in people's houses.
Yeah, exactly. Avalacha is chazik, but says the Gemara, but that's because we don't know the status of this sandwich or this piece of meat. But if we knew its status, you wanted to override its status, then Eid Echad wouldn't be good enough. So, for example, in the case here, she's an Eishes Ish. She's a married woman. Everybody was at her chassid.
That's the chazaka.
That's the chazaka. The question is, have we moved past that? Have we overridden that? So Eid Echad's not going to be good enough for that.
But don't you need that for Arias? You need two witnesses for everything, no?
Yeah. So that there are two girsos.
Not even to override. I mean, for any issue relating to Arias.
So there are two girsos in the Gemara. Our Gemara reads as follows: Aval hacha is chazik isura de eishes ish have a davar shebe'erva. So the Gemara mentions both, and if you look at the Rishonim, they're troubled. They say, shouldn't it be either or? We will get back to this, and I'm going to make the suggestion, according to some, that maybe it's two ways of saying the same thing. But if you look at the Mefarshim, they really are troubled by this. If you look at Tosas on Beis Amud Beis, where you have a parallel discussion. On the bottom of the page, have a davar shebe'erva. Says, "Hi denaka davar shebe'erva omerim mishum dabi sharab b'shari surim kidon tel v'hekdesh." Meaning, they're troubled. Why do you need both of these ideas? And earlier, Tosa says, "Mid habi akol duyo shabbatorah." Maybe it should be erva. So you're right. The question you're raising is a good question. The Mefarshim asked that question. The Rishonim asked that question. Okay. Either way, the Gemara's final conclusion is that the answer, so how we're back to square one. How can you get away with one witness? Says the Gemara, "Bedinu de bekim shtaris nami loli boy, kid Reish Lakish, damar Reish Lakish, ina machsum al ashtar nasik mishenech kraidusan bebezdin, barabanan hu da'atzruch, hacha mishum aguna akilu baraban." So the Gemara says, really, you don't need to verify the signatures of a loan because the loan document defends itself. Based on the position of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, that the witnesses signed in a contract,
if they've been interrogated.
It's as if they were interrogated and proven to be true. So since the shtar defends itself, Minat Torah, you never need kiyum shtaros. You don't have to validate or verify the signatures. Midrabanan, rabbinic law, they were more stringent about this. And since it's only a rabbinic requirement, they shaved it down to one aid because since it's a rabbinic requirement and they were considering, the problem of aguna, meaning they don't want to make the standard so difficult to achieve that she's, forever going to be searching, for ways to validate her get. So they the compromise was all you need is one witness and then she can remarry. That's the Gemara. So what it comes out of this Gemara is a very remarkable din. This is what we've been discussing. And that is that the din of Reish Lakish, which is the cornerstone of contract law in halacha, namely that we treat a signed contract as if there were virtual, witnesses who saw the transaction and who are here in court, to be interrogated and to, confirm the validity of what they claim took place. Now, none of that happened because it's just a piece of paper that was signed, and we're not even sure if it was signed, authentically or not. But that's the chiddush of Reish Lakish. That's what Reish Lakish is.
What's also interesting, he doesn't differentiate between Davar Shabarava or anything else. Everything's on the same plane.
For Reish Lakish, yeah. That's a good point. And with Rashi explains the reason for it is, if you look at Rashi, Nasa Commissionekor, just some Bezin, Lo Chatzef Inish Liziyufe. It's based in part on an umdana, and that is like people, they're not going to forge contracts. Halavai. As we discussed last week, Tosas.
That's generational.
Maybe. Tosas and Ksuvas asked the question, aren't you opening the door for, chicanery?
The Talmud Chacham Cook. He knows the.
So that's like the Tosas on Chav Ches Amud Aleph. Tosas says, you are, you're asking for trouble because you're basically telling everybody that a signed contract protects itself, and therefore anybody who wants to commit fraud, is going to be motivated to sign a contract. So the answer is lo chatzef finish lizyufe. But how strong is that? Right? Meaning,
what you're also saying though is that it can be overridden with Adam. Adam can't come and say it's not so. But in a default position, you believe it. But it doesn't mean that.
No, I didn't say that yet. But now that's what we're going to discuss.
No, because in other words, because that's part of the reason I would think logically why a person wouldn't have the chutzpah. Just like the woman's afraid the guy's going to show up, the husband's going to show up. If somebody can come and say, "Wait a minute now, that's not my signature," or that's
right. So this is the big argument. So this is what we began to discuss last time, and what you're saying makes a lot of sense. It seems like you're on the team of Rabbi Vigdor Cohen or Cohen Tzedek. As we're going to read inside in just a second, but we'll see that the Or Zarua, who was his contemporary colleague, disagrees. So this is the point. This is the issue. In the Gemara, there's an ambiguity. The Gemara at minimum tells us that if a get shows up in court, and there's no indication one way or another whether it's a fraud or whether it's authentic,
default position.
That Minatorah default, it can be used as a get and she can move forward with her life. That's clear. And the only reason that we insist on on some sort of validation is a midrabanan. It's a rabbinic stringency, which is very logical, by the way. There's a lot at stake. So the idea that, this piece
you
of
don't
paper...
want to have problems later on.
Yeah, exactly. But that's only a rabbinic requirement. What do they call it? What do they say these days? Out of, what's the newest phrase? Out of excessive caution or an excess of caution?
Abundance of caution.
Abundance of caution, that's it. Like it's part of the new speak out there, right? Out of an abundance...
Suspender and belt.
What?
Yeah, suspender and belt.
Yeah, exactly.
In the old days.
Out of an abundance of caution. So out of an abundance of caution, the Chachamim said that, you can't, a contract that has important implications, also needs to be verified. But Minat Torah, I'm interested in Minat Torah for the moment. Minat Torah, from biblical law side itself, it doesn't. That's clear. What's not clear is what you asked, which is, let's say there's an actual attack on the authenticity of this document. Does that make a difference? Does it defend itself against, default, or it defends itself?
So
Default
what
concern?
we're really saying is that if you treat it like it has two Adam there, then two Adam come in and contradict, it's 2 against 2, nothing happens. And you
Yeah.
can't change it. So
And
if
if
you
it's the
want,
same
to make it
Adam-
like there would be 2 real Adam sitting there, then 2 people coming can't affect anything.
Exactly. So let's take 2 scenarios for the moment, and we'll see the two. These are 2 issues that are discussed. One is, let's say the husband appeals. Let's say he comes to court and he says this divorce is fraudulent. So then, is it the husband against 2 witnesses? That's not even.
What is he claiming is fraudulent? He's saying, I never gave the sofa the right.
I never divorced her. They're saying, what are you talking about? Here's the divorce.
No,
He's
but what
saying-
is he saying? Is he saying, because remember, he has to tell the sofa to make the get, right?
Right. He's saying, I never
Well,
commissioned
that he
it.
should have belief. I mean, after all, he's the one that had to give the sofa the right to do it. But
Yeah,
if he's
but
going to say the signatures are
let's-
false or something,
Right, but let's
he
use
doesn't
your
have the
own.
right to say that. He's no more expert on whether the signatures are false than anybody else, and he's no yeah, but
No. He says I never commissioned this get.
well,
I know
that he should be the ultimate source for. Because
Not if there are 2
the get-
witnesses.
The get has to be
Not if there are
strong.
not if there are 2 witnesses that deny what he says and say, what are you talking about? You did commission us. So are there 2 witnesses or not? There's a signature on a piece of paper. So this is the question. So the Rambam in Perek Zayin, this is what I mentioned last week, in Perek Zayin of Hilchos Gerushin Halacha Beis, in our Mara Makomos, that, by the way, is on page, 1 second. For those of you who have the Mara Makomos, I hope you all do. Page 1. Wow. Okay. On page 1 of the Mara Makomos, if not, you can just listen along. Gerushin Perek Zayin Halacha Beis. The Ram says the following: Bo habal, if the husband comes to court, the irer, and he objects, he appeals, and what does he say? The Amar, and he says, Lo gerashti me'olam. I never divorced her. What about this piece of paper? The get shehu vala, the get that was given to her, mizuyafu, it is a forgery, right? Yiskayim bechosama. So the Rambam paskins, well, now there's a dispute. So we need to verify.
Well, he can only confirm the first part. He can't.
1 second.
He
It
only
doesn't matter.
knows he never authorized it. He doesn't know anything else.
If he didn't authorize it, and he's telling
Ipso facto, it must be forged.
then it's a forgery. It doesn't matter if it's a forgery because there's no such people, or because people who the signatures are the people who claim they signed, but they didn't sign with the authority of the. It's also forgery, right? So this is what the Rambam says: you have to get kiyum chosama. You have to get validation. What if you can't? What if you can't? Vim lo niskayim, velo nodu edav klal. We're not able to figure it out. So the Rambam says, Teitzei vavlad mamzer, sharei eina migureshes. The Rambam is very clear, and that is that the irur habal, the Baal's complaint, right, his appeal, if it cannot be neutralized, is effective.
What happened to Reish Lakish?
What happened to Reish Lakish? The
There's
answer
2
is
witnesses against the Baal, we just said a minute ago.
this is the gray area.
It's
Is it
not
against
gray.
Reish?
2 against 1 is not great.
It's not 2 against 1 because it's about a kind of a.
If we take Reish Lakish literally, it's 2 against 1.
Right. So, but in order to take Reish Lakish literally, there may be a catch-22, and that is that you have to first assume that there is, that this isn't a forgery. Once it's not a forgery, it's
Yeah, but
evident.
that's circular reasoning. I mean, we say that the
It's
document.
circular reasoning, but in the opposite direction.
Yeah, whatever. But
Meaning, no. Meaning, it's not that it's 2 witnesses, and you're trying to tell me it's not. It's maybe not, and you're trying to tell me that it is.
no, we were saying that you have to accept the document as being correct. Okay.
Right? The question is, if you
Now
know the
you're saying
document is
that-
correct,
Now you're saying that if one person objects to it. the
what do you mean one
document-
person? It's not one person, it's the Baal who originates the document. But let me put it this way. As I'm just going to remind you of something we saw last week.
You don't consider him an Ageh B'Davar?
The din of Reish Lakish appears in one other Gemara. That's the Gemara in Ksuvas Daf Yud Chesem Beis. There it's in the context of Kivin Shehigid Shuvin Achozer Magid, which means the following. When witnesses come to court and they testify, they can't, just recant their testimony. Let's say Reuven and Shimon, the witnesses, come to court and they tell a story, right? And they're interrogated, and then they leave the court. And then the next morning they come back and they say, you know what? It was all a hoax.
We made a mistake.
Or we made a mistake. Can they do that? So the Gemara says no, because Kivin Shehigid, right? Shuvei Nechozer Magid. Once you have testified and the books have been closed on that testimony, there's no recanting, because otherwise, there's no end.
Put
to,
pressure on everybody to recant.
Right. So once the interrogation or the examination of all this takes place, there's no recanting. So the Gemara says in Ksubas, because of the din of Reish Lakish, that is true for Eidos B'Shtar as well. Meaning, if Edom admit that they are the legitimate Edom on the shtar, but they say, you know what, we signed it, but it was a hoax, the Gemara says we don't believe them. Because by signing it, that's the equivalent of testifying in court and being interrogated. That's what Reish Lakish says. I'm sorry, that's what he says.
Isn't it also a question of making themselves
edusan bebezdin. So if it's like being interrogated, it's like kivin shigit shuvin achozer magid. So what the Rishonim say is as follows. Just one more second. So the Rishonim say the following. Saying Reish Lakish in the Ksuvas case is a chiddush, but at least there's no paradox, because the guy admits that the Edom admit that they signed. Now they're just saying, yeah, but it was a hoax, or yeah, but we didn't mean it, right? So as long as we know that they signed and it's a proper shtar, it's like there are two witnesses. But in the case in Gittin, where the problem is that it's protecting itself against the claim of forgery, say some of the Rishonim, that's a little bit of a paradox, because it's one thing to say, oh, the signatures are real, and now you have to accept the consequences of this evidence. But if the signatures are not established as real, what makes it a shtar? That's the whole point. We're trying to figure out if it's real. That is a paradox. So the chiddush, but you're not wrong, by the way. But I'm just trying to explain to you that there's a legitimate argument going on here. Meaning, on the one hand, that is the chiddush of Reish Lakish. We treat it like two witnesses. We treat it that way default. Would we even treat it that way when our concerns are heightened by the fact that there's an actual charge of not just illegality, but of chicanery? Would we still insist, that the shtar protects itself when we're not even sure, if it's anything more than a piece of paper? If it's more than a piece of paper, and the question is to apply this edus or to insist on, continuing to rely on this edus as opposed to allowing the edom to recant. So we have like a foundation of this contract that it starts off as being valid, partially validated, and then we say Reish Lakish. But if the whole question is it just a fake, or is it real, and there's an actual accusation that it's a fake, so that's why the Rambam says that if the Baal is ma'arer, if you can't neutralize his claim, then we're going to say Vlad Mamzer. Meaning we're not going to let her use this divorce to begin a new life, because until it's the catch-22. You're not going to apply Reish Lakish here. However, the Rambam's view is the minority view. The majority disagree with the Rambam. They say, too bad, that's part of Reish Lakish. So this argument actually is an argument in Ashkenaz between Rab Avigdor Kohen Tzedek and the Or Zarua. And I want to read you the case, but I'm going to pause for a moment in case there are questions. you'll see this crazy case. If you can follow along, it's on
Why
page
does it have to be
5.
black and white? In other words, why does it have to be that, okay, this star is immutable? I mean, it is what it is. I don't care what you say. Or the
Yeah.
other one that says, wait a minute, it's only so good until somebody clicks against it and says it's not good. Okay. Why can't we say that if one person or even if two Adim come, it's a standoff? Maybe there's something else that will tip the scales. That would be in other words, why do we have to destroy Reish Lakish's concept? Yeah, okay, it has some validity. Now you got to bring me something stronger than just an offsetting.
Well, we're not necessarily doing that. Well, we're so far we're going to examine 2 cases. One is if the Baal himself is ma'arer, he's a relevant party, so we care about what he initially, at least. And if he's claiming that he's a victim of a hoax, right? To just say, well, sorry, we have ink on this piece of paper, we're ignoring you. That seems, I mean, I understand.
Maybe he would have to bring two Adim with him together with, you have to raise the bar to defeat.
Right, he's not saying to destroy the shtar. He's saying you bring 2 Adim to verify it. It's easier to bring Adim to verify the signatures than it is to bring 2 Adim to prove
a negative, yeah, right.
The hoax, right? But we're dealing with 2 cases. That's one case. The second case that the Rambam doesn't deal with, but that the Rabbi Vigdor deals with, is let's say the 2 Adim themselves came
It's a
to
known hoax. It's an obvious hoax.
Now that's not Kivin Shigit Shuvin Lechozer Magid, because Kivin Shigit Shuvin Lechozer Magid in the classical case is a case where they said, yes, we signed, but we didn't mean it.
So
Here
the
they would say the 2 Adim come to court and they say
people
that's not our signature.
supposedly signed are coming and say, Lo Devar Me'olam. We never signed anything.
Right. So even then there's an argument between Rabbi Vigdor and the Or Zarua. How remarkable is that? So I'm going to show you that.
How can the alter ego be better than the actual?
Well, I don't know, but you just did a good job before.
No, but you have to defend every side of the position. In other words,
Right.
the Shtar has credibility. This case is different than the Rambam's case. Here you got the guy who supposedly signed. Okay, the Baal I'm not impressed with because he may have to change his mind. He can also lie about it. Okay,
Right, but remember, we're
He's
not
not
just taking his
Gerbedava.
word.
Baal isn't a Gerbedava.
Right. But remember, we're not taking.
Maybe he
his
doesn't
word.
want to pay out the ksuba. And 1,000 reasons.
Right. No, everything you're saying is true, except for one thing, and that's what you said before, which is we don't need to say, we don't need to be extreme. We don't need to say, it's dead in the water or it's fully good. All the Baal is saying is don't proceed without investigating and authenticating the signatures. Isn't that a legitimate argument for somebody?
Not according to Reish Lakish, it's not.
Well, no, this is the question. The Rambam isn't going against Reish Lakish. The Rambam is saying that
interpreting what Reish Lakish meant.
never said.
Reish Lakish only meant so long as no one is challenging the forgery.
Right. I'm going to show you that inside in Rabbi Vigdor. So
Even
this
according
story-
to the one who holds that there's no that the person will not have chutzpah.
Everybody's assuming that broadly speaking, people don't have chutzpah to be mezayev, but we all know that there are exceptions to all rules.
But you have to have a low plug, no?
You can have a low
We
plug,
do
but
that
you
by a
don't-
Baal Chov. We don't make exceptions.
Right, but you don't want to be matir and isha l'shuk and invite mamzerus because you're doing a low plug. So why not be extra cautious and and wait until you verify the signatures?
If
The low plug-
the halacha is that, there wouldn't be mamzerus. Mamzerus is a halachic issue. If the halacha
No.
was firm, then you wouldn't have
That's not-
mamzerus.
I mean, but in the end of the day, sometimes you can always have 2 other witnesses who come, outside witnesses, who establish this and that. But certainly, I mean, there is a factual question here: is this piece of paper a get or is it not a get? If it turns out the piece of paper is not a get, she's an Eshes Ish and her child is a
But
mom.
even if holds the bezin, knocks the gavel and says it's
Doesn't make a difference. Remember, we read last week in the Mishnah in Yevamos, where the Mishnah says that the Bezdin received testimony that this woman's husband was dead.
But isn't the Gemara always saying that we don't
Just
want
one second. And then Ba Harog Baraglav, after she remarried at the say-so of the Bezdin, the dead husband shows up, not so dead, right? And the Mishnah says, Teitzim Mizev Mizev Avlad Mamzer. because sometimes there are
What happened to Zilzal Bezdin? All the time the
Lizi-
Gemara is upset about, oh, we have to
in
protect.
Dine Mominus, we say things like there's an argument whether we say Lizilusa de Bedina Chashinan or not, meaning that's in Dine Mominus. But when you're talking about a definition of Eishes Ish, it's similar to the Gemara. The Gemara says, Tanach de Kodesh Bekaspa, de Kodesh Bebia Michael Neymar, meaning Mi'ika Midi de Midoraisa. The Gemara says, is it possible that Minat Torah, she's married and you're going to allow her to marry someone else? You can't do that unless you say things like Afkin Rabban the Kedusha, which is a radical, revision of legal history, which you want to avoid as much as you can. So the answer is sometimes, when you do the right things, you're protected. Sometimes you do the right things because that's the right thing. And sometimes if it all blows up in your face, there are consequences, even if you do the right thing. Here is things that are definitional, meaning either this is or isn't that. If this is a fraud and it's not a get, then she's married. Nothing took her away from that marriage. It doesn't matter whether you can
So
claim.
how would a God-fearing woman ever be able to be married?
No.
I'm not following.
No, I mean,
But
in other words, two Adam come, and yet the halachic fact is that
Because the answer is because when two Adam come, that is certainty until it's not. And the
that's a very scary proposition.
not really, because
That's how we scare the woman when 1/8 comes. We say,
No.
it can
when
happen.
the incidence of Bahorog Baraglov, when you have when you have the requisite level of edus, are very, very rare. In law, we're interested in those cases because they highlight anomalies or vulnerabilities. They accentuate certain unusual circumstances, which is what we learn from because we've isolated different factors from each other. But the actual incidence of these occurrences are obviously going to be extremely, extremely rare. And therefore, we don't worry about them as long as we're doing the right. There's a balance. I think I mentioned this last week. In my opinion, the reason that the Masechta Gittin begins with Fani Nachtam, which is a Gzeira D'Rabbanan, is precisely because they want to raise our consciousness about the, two poles, two, concerns.
Pressure points.
Being too cautious, and being too,
the example of that Rambam uses, just think about it. We can't cater to the extreme. Go to the trouble of making a star. Two guys sign it. Yeah. Now the chances and the Baal is saying he's not even commenting about the document. He's not even involved in any way, shape, or form about the signature or the document. He just said it didn't happen. Right. So which is more likely, that somebody comes with a document that looks normal, feels normal, but it's more likely that he wants out than that there's actually a defect in. He's rejecting the validity of the shtar, or the get rather, as a shtar in general. And the bottom line is, so he's got to know that somehow he's not going to be believed. Now, if it turns out that he never did it, we'll have to live with that, but no one's going to know. So it would be okay. It's not, you can't say because you can't always have, as serious it is, the idea of Eishes Ish as something that's going to, the fear of that always contravening everything. It's not that we don't respect that, but there are.
Right. That's because otherwise that's Aguna. Then you lock people up.
Right. So we can't all of us, then there's no way to go.
Right. That's what I mean by the balance. Meaning you have to weigh.
Extreme. Everyone's going to be an Aguna. Everyone's going to be an Eishes.
Right.
It just
and the actual.
Actually, that's what Reish Lakish was trying to do with his regulation by saying,
No.
You have to have
Reish Lakish
in the document.
Regulation. Reish Lakish is a biblical category of Eidos Shebashtar. Now, if you want to say that the Tamei mitzvos of that is to make things more, flexible, that may be true.
No, it's not a question of flexibility.
No, I don't think
if you don't have a if you don't have a foundation of, there has to be
You,
something,
because
It's part of the legal,
It's
it's part of the legal system. It's
something
not-
has to be credible, otherwise
Right.
you
Right, that's exactly it. So
Right, all
on the
these,
one hand, Reish
these
Lakish,
guys, so sniping at the guy is not going to help the overall system. That's the foundational part you're talking about with race lectures. But let me ask you another point. So
Yeah.
not to throw a wrench in this, but we have the whole concept of Adam Zomerman.
Yeah.
Right? Could you have Adam Zomerman on the veracity of the star? So for instance, these guys say, this is our signature. And now Adam Zomerman said, well, you can say what you want, but when you signed it, when this thing was signed, there's a date, you were with us in Detroit. Could you actually have a case like that? Where,
Chicago.
what?
Chicago. Ellie Adam Zomerman are from Chicago.
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like the underworld of Chicago.
Let me put it this way,
Democratic enough.
in the Midwest, you could find them. You can't find them in California, like Andy said, right?
Right.
And Andy, they basically used to empty the warehouse, and he was in California. So, but seriously, Chicago. Okay, so the reality is, so what if you had Adam Sullivan say, we were with this guy. Here's the date. We're not, and it throws by it's not establishing the signature or not. So we don't know how it got there, but the bottom line is you were with us. Is that a case out there that we
Yeah,
could?
I think so, for sure.
So how?
It's similar.
Adam Zomerman, Trump.
I don't think you even need Adam Zomerman. I think all you really need is two witnesses, to say, Adam Zomerman is even stronger, but you could have just HaKosher.
Right. But
We're talking about a case where there are no
Baal-
Adam. We're talking about here in cases where you have the default presence of a contract in court. And on the other side, you have either the fear of an appeal, or in the case of the Rambam and Rabbi Victor, we'll get to in a moment, an actual appeal, but you don't have any further evidence. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure it out based on validating the signatures. But if you had two other witnesses, not the same witnesses, who came and said, this didn't happen, you wouldn't call that trey. You'd say, oh, in light of that.
Right. So the Adam Zomerman concept is, so now you have some evidence based on ADUS itself that casts, that is not 2 against 2, but that casts aspersions on the document. But the Baal saying it didn't happen is not in the same category.
Right, but the Baal saying, you have to understand something. The Baal saying it didn't happen is a serious charge for the following reason. The Baal doesn't have to divorce his wife. So there's a certain,
but it's just common sense that's a less likely scenario. That it's more likely that he's had charata, and if we allow him that, then you'll always.
Let's say she wants a divorce. He's not giving her a divorce, right? She scrawls something on a piece of paper. She comes to court. That can't happen. Of course, it can happen.
I think it's an imbalance of fear in the sense and you will
remember, all he's claiming is don't allow her to remarry simply based on the fact that she produced this document, which I'm claiming is forgery. Force an investigation to at least find out whether the people who she claimed signed really signed. As I said before, it's like I was answering before. This is not, a mutually exclude, either nothing happens or it's a total green light.
Are we ignoring the?
We want to know, is it possible that sometimes the Baal is telling the truth in his ear? Of course it's possible.
Are we ignoring the Dine Mamonis aspect because the Arias aspect is so much more severe? Because
I think we're starting with the
There's
Arias.
also a financial issue here. If he's a butcher, it's going to cost some money.
In theory, this could be a financial issue. Let's say a mechira, real estate deal.
Right.
Let's say again, the
It cost him a lot of money to divorce him.
What?
It could cost him a lot of money, the divorce. He has to pay the ksuba.
Okay, but forget about the divorce. Let's say any case. Let's say a loan contract. Let's say a real estate contract. Somebody comes to court, they have the document, and the other guy says, this document which purports me to have sold you my real estate is fraudulent. I didn't do it. Maybe the guy wants the real estate, the other guy never wants to sell, so he forges a document. It could happen.
I'm not a
Again,
lawyer.
we assume default, if there's no charge, we're not worried about it because lo chatzah finish l'ziyufe and kim shtaris drabanan. But if once somebody makes a claim, that already raises greater credibility that this unusual circumstance actually
But
happened.
the claim usually can't come from the Baldova. For example,
Who would it come from?
by a Balchov. Okay, the guy's claiming you owe me money, and yet when the guy denies
The
everything,
Malva says to the Lova,
somebody will not have the chutzpah to deny in front of his Balchov. The Balchov says, "What are you talking about? He owes me the money." You know.
the Lova says to the Malva says to the Lova, you owe me $100, and the Lova says to the Malva, I paid you back already.
No, but the point is
That's what Toin Beniton is.
Well, one of the reasonings we give is that he will not have the chutzpah in front of his Balchov to deny
The Meis Pana b'fnei Balchov, to deny the whole thing. That's
right. And yet, even though the Balchov is screaming, "I'm telling the truth,"
right, but not true for
screaming. So now we have the same thing in Gittin, and we
No,
don't say that
fine,
the
but
star holds up.
this is a little bit different. Here is a situation where he's claiming, I'm not your divorced husband. I never initiated anything. Anyway, the Rambam takes it very seriously. Let's look for a moment at Rabbi Vigdor. You'll see the Rabbi Vigdor even goes further than the Rambam, but the case is just an unbelievable case. So the case is, if you look here on page 5, if you can have it, it's an elaborate case. So worthwhile looking inside.
I'm listening to a lecture on the Talmud on Zoom.
Okay, page 5. Everybody have Mordechai Masechet Kiddushin, Hagos Mordechai Bepiskei Kiddushin, Remez Tuf Kuf Samach Tes. Yes?
Anyone not have it?
I like that anyone not have it thing.
Try that. That's easier.
You're an idealist, You're not fooling me, but either way, it's good. So listen to this. This is like Jacob, I think you're going to enjoy the case.
I'm ready.
Okay. Not because it's a horrible case, but it's like it's good theater. All right. My Sahaya B'Shnei B'nei Adam. Okay, I'll read it slowly, so those of you who don't have it in front of you will pick it. I'll translate. My Sahaya B'Shnei B'nei Adam Shayu Sonim Zelazel. Like, what a way to begin. You have these two people, and they hate each other. Okay, how much do they hate each other?
It's not Losis Nechicha B'Levavecha, because obviously everybody knows about it.
That's true. And not only that, they really know about it now, because halach echad v'hishchid artiloi echad. So one guy goes out and he bribes, a third party. I mean, he hires, a third party, right? Sheyotzi laz al bito shel chavero, to defame or to ruin the life. Reuven and Shimon are antagonists. Reuven goes out and hires Levi to orchestrate the destruction of Shimon's daughter.
So how many Averas is he over?
I'm going to leave that to you to figure out. We'll get back to that. You start calculating, but quite a few, right? He's not a good guy.
Right.
Anyway, so what did he do? He fabricated a marriage to the daughter of Shimon to mess up her life in retaliation to the father.
He's fabricating. I was going to guess. He's fabricating a rotten guy to mess up a family, or he's fabricating a good girl to ruin her name. Which one? What's he doing again? How's he fabricating?
Reuven and Shimon don't like each other.
Yeah, I got that.
Hires an agent to make it seem as if Reuven's daughter is married.
Okay.
So that she,
even though she's a Penuya, she's not married.
correct.
Right.
So she will be officially married, even though she's a Pnuya, and that will ruin her life.
So
Even if you get a
he's
divorce
making it she'll never
ultimately.
get married. That she doesn't want her to get married. He's trying to ruin the daughter of his enemy by saying that she's married when she's single, so no
Correct.
one marries her. Correct?
Correct.
Sort of
And
the
not only
case.
that, but even if there's a divorce, she won't be able to marry a Kohen.
Okay.
And
Okay.
some people won't
Anyways,
want to marry her
listen to
anyway,
this.
for whatever reason. Yeah.
Behiskir Edim, once you start, you got to go all the way, right? So he gave him, he had to hire this agent to set it all up, the disruptor, we'll call him. And then the disruptor had to hire
This is really creative.
illegal Edim, right? Shehidu Shekidshu. And not only that, the Kosvu Shtar. And then they produced a contract, a Shtar Kiddushin, that said, Bifanenu Chasume Mata, in the presence of we, signed below, Kidesh Ploni Esbas Ploni, right? This man married this woman. It's the daughter of the other guy. And not only that, but we verified the signatures in this Shtar Kiddushin, right? I think you'd all agree this is even much more unlikely than the cases we were discussing before. But this is something that really happened. So they have basically a
Edekiyum, like, I mean, they're
no. Edekiyum chosamos.
Yeah. that's what I
Yeah.
mean.
Or dayanim, however, meaning you have judges who are evaluating the signatures who are signing on that it's authentic. So you have a forged star, testifying about a false marriage, and now you have he bought off 3 judges.
Well, what is surprising is that usually crooks of this nature know that if they take on 5 different people into the scheme,
You're widening. It's not good. It's not a good tactic.
no,
Too many.
it's gonna come out at the end of the day.
You got to keep the fraud in a
Narrow vein.
closer circle. But echad min dayanim are yakarav l'nara, so it's even better. One of the dayanim who signs on the authentication, he is a relative of the girl.
How's that? It's not
So he's also pasul l'dayanus,
yeah.
and it doesn't speak so well of him either that he's perpetuating this fraud on his relative, right? Anyways, uba karov, the echad min ha'edim ha'chasumim. I'm sorry, uba ha'karov, the echad min ha'chasum el ha'henpek. So 2 of the 3 of these judges show up in court. One who's a relative, so he's pasul anyway. The other one who claims that that he's authentic. But the third guy, the heidu b'fnei bezin sha'idim b'shtar heidu al ksav yadam. They claim everything is, kadasu kadin. These are real signatures. But the Gimel, the third dayan who's needed for the verification of the signatures, lo bala bezin l'ha'id al kacha. He refuses to come. The gamo edim maksumim b'shtar hakidushin makhishin edahen. Meanwhile, the 2 witnesses that supposedly signed, whose signatures are being verified, they now come to court and they say, we don't know anything about any of this. We didn't sign this document. We never signed it. And not only that, but the Gam Balashtar, the so-called husband now shows up in court and he says, Modad Shtar Shel Kiddushim Mizuyafu. What do you think?
There's something,
I understand
By the way,
question.
this is a real
something
case.
seriously mentally wrong with these people.
Yeah, but what's the question? What are we thinking about?
Oh,
It sounds
we
like he
wanna
made
know,
up,
but-
Is whether Reish Lakish star can withstand all of this.
sounds like he made up a case to justify the Rambam.
well, they don't.
Like-
This is not,
I mean,
historical.
here's an example of where the Baal coming and saying that it's Mizuyaf and why we should take it seriously, because look at this chain of events.
Right.
Where in fact he is right.
But you
Yeah,
said,
but you want to know something? The Arzarua, I'm going to read it to you in a few minutes. The Arzarua says this reeks of a hoax, but there's still Reish Lakish, and you still can't get away from Reish Lakish.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm
Commend
missing
them.
something.
I commend them.
What are we thinking about? You can't get away with
We're trying to-
Lakish.
We want to know whether or not
Yeah.
she needs a get as a chumrah because there's a possibility that the star.
Recap, what
Let
do
him
we
say
have
it.
from with
Andy, let him finish,
testimony
please.
that's
Andy, let him
contrary to
finish.
Reish Lakish?
If there's a possibility, Andy, give him 1 second. There's a
I just
possibility.
can't hear everybody at the same time. You have to take one at a time.
But yeah, please say what you were saying before. Andy, 1 second. What were you saying? Please say what you were saying, Rabbi Rosensweig. You were about to finish.
What I'm saying is that on the one hand, you have a contract that shows up in court. Reish Lakish says that any contract is default deemed to be authentic. On the other hand, the circumstantial evidence of this particular contract is extremely damaging, to any possibility that this is real. So what I'm trying to show you is that in this case, there is an argument between Rabbi Vigdor, Kohen, Tzedek, who was an authority in Ashkenaz, and his contemporary, the very famous Or Zarua of Vienna, Rabbi Yitzchak Or Zarua, who actually says that you just can't ignore this because Reish Lakish is still a factor. Meaning, how, to put it the way we put it before, how much self-protection does Reish Lakish provide for a contract? This is a case that's about as extreme as you could imagine.
What's not clear here is, and I think the first thing we should be looking at is, forget about circumstance. What testimony, if any, do we have that this is a fraud? In other words, you said that.
So what I'm going to show you in a second
People's signature was on
this
there.
is the case. By the way, what David said before was a great point, but it just happens not to be true. You're saying we have this crazy case; it's all made up because you just can't believe that this really
I
happened.
think this is a hoax on us. to be honest with you.
You said that it's a crazy case to justify a Rambam like psak. But 1 second. But what you're going to see is that Rabbi Vigdor doesn't know the Rambam historically; they're not. But whatever. But what Rabbi Vigdor is going to end up saying is this is a crazy case. But even if it wasn't so crazy, the very fact that the
Maybe
Baal,
those original say this.
if the Baal alone was Ma'ar and you didn't have the rest of it, or if the Adim themselves said, we never signed this, that would still torpedo Reish Lakish.
But Rabbi, you said.
Whereas, one more second, the Or Zarua says, if it's the Baal and the Adim, then Reish Lakish is going to continue to protect the star.
Why?
But what will he say in this particular case?
Why?
So crazy.
Yeah, but why
No,
would
but
he
not-
in this case?
No, the last point. you
Wait,
made-
I'm
would he?
going to take one person at a time.
Last
Well,
point
Andy
you
and I are
made
saying
is
the thing.
he's-
Why would he protect this case? It's such a
Because Reish
fraudulent
Lakish's
case.
view is that there's a certain default self-protective clause in a halachic contract that creates a presumption of authenticity unless you can prove 100% that it's not.
Right, but this case is not. It doesn't fall in that parameter because everyone knows
this is
it's
a
fraud.
case that triggered. Let's say it this way. This is a case that this is a real case that took place. Apparently, by the way, in the Or Zarua version, there are names.
So Rabbi, this is not a made-up case.
We have the names. We have the date of the. You want to see it for a second?
But the point is that I think we're getting away from the greater clarity. The clarity here is we have to establish what is how much evidence is needed to defeat Reish Lakish.
Right.
If you come to conclusion on that, then the case either falls in there or doesn't fall in there. So even though
The only thing that's significant,
it's very
the only
simple.
thing that's
The
significant
problem
thing
is
about
we don't know the
case-
answer to the first question because we have an
Right,
argument.
So we do know
How
the
much
answer.
evidence is needed?
Well, we have to read further to get the answer to the question. You'll have to give me another minute.
In other words, if the question here is, if nothing defeats Reish Lakish, then even though you know it's you got a problem. It's one of those sad situations.
Right.
If
Or Zarua says that.
But
Or
that's
Zarua says she needs a get no matter what here.
but I don't think the Rambam or anybody else takes that kind of a position that
Right,
nothing.
but it doesn't matter. But you see, the point that you're making is correct. Meaning there are two different issues here. One is the resolution. This is a real case.
So why did we say that it's a made-up? I can't remember who said it was a made-up case.
No, it's not a made-up case.
Well, I understand, but I can't remember. David, I think you said
David,
well,
yeah, David.
this was made up to validate the Rambam's position.
He was joking a little bit, but
No,
yeah.
no, I appreciate it. But first of all, just in general, I think we all know that reality very often trumps,
No, this is a real case.
No, and so I don't know why we.
I think I think the fraudsters today could look back on this and get some instruction. You know, I mean, this is
Anyway,
like,
look at the Orzarua just for 1 minute. I just want to show
this
you
is
that it's a real
really,
case.
it's like you said, it's like, if you saw this on television, you wouldn't believe it, but.
And that's why I
here
told
it
you you'd enjoy it. It's a very entertaining case.
But
Look
my
on page
contention is that the problem is not the case. The problem is that we can't come to an agreement as to what it takes
What do you
to
mean? What do you
validate
know?
Rish Lakish's star. If we
No,
can come to
we
a
have an
conclusion
argument
on that,
between-
then everything would follow that, but we don't have
We
any.
do. We just, you're being impatient. We haven't finished reading the
No, we have a
Tshuva.
machlokus on that, no, as to,
We have two different views, meaning just like we have the Rambam, we have Rabbi Vigdor, and against the Rambam and Rabbi Vigdor, we have the Orzarua.
yes, what I'm saying is that all they're doing basically is following one or the other of the basic fundamental.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to explain to you is, if you look at the halachic literature on this topic, this case is the case. This is the Brown versus Board of Education, or the Roe v. Wade of
Look how those turned out.
of Reish Lakish and Kiyum. And that's also true of this. This is the precedent.
We
this question, how
test
far we
Reish
can-
Lakish's viewpoints and the different approaches to it by coming up with this extreme case and say,
But
okay,
they didn't come up
now
with
everybody
something
come out
new.
with your reasoning and let's see if it makes any
Wait,
sense.
what you're saying, to be
They didn't-
serious, is here's a real case. Here's the
It's a-
real case that illustrates why that fundamental machlokus is so important.
Correct.
Exactly.
This
Why
is a
are you
real
saying that it's
case
made up?
where Rabbi one second. This is a real case where Rabbi Vigdor gave a psak halacha, saying there are vulnerabilities even in Reish Lakish, not just in this crazy case. In any case,
General.
you have to let me read the words. I'm not up to there yet. Where whenever the Baal is ma'arer or the Edom themselves disassociate by claiming that there was a ziyuf, says the Rabbi Vigdor, in those two circumstances, you will never apply Reish Lakish. And the Orzarua disagree. They both argue based on their reading of Ar Gemara and Gimel and Aleph and Gittin, as you'll see in a moment, if we have time. And the Orzarua disagrees and says, no, the way to read Gittin, Gimel and Aleph is that even in the craziest of circumstances, the default of Reish Lakish, which is that the shtar is presumed to be kosher, even when the Baal and even if the Edim and even if both together claim otherwise, Minatorah, we would be machmir, like in this case, we would insist that there be a get. Now you could say, but it reeks of fraud. That's where your comment about low plug, sometimes the greater good of upholding the legality of this, fascinating idea of Reish Lakish, can sometimes, the Rambam, I've mentioned this in the past, but the Rambam in Mar Nevuchim, says, towards the early part of Mar Nevuchim, says even a system of divine law,
Can have bad results.
can have occasional bad results because you have to sacrifice, for the, objective low plug, system, and sometimes there will be abuses.
Humanity has a place in carrying out the wishes of the divine.
Correct. Well said.
But that's what I was saying earlier, is that reality basically trumps.
Yeah, it can be
fiction.
more
There's
peculiar.
no question.
Listen to this. I'm just going to read you from the Orzarua just to show you it's a real case. The Orzarua is on page 7. Firstly, starts off by saying, by the little poetry, so did Rabbi Vigdor, because they liked each other, even though they were locked in this fierce disagreement about this case and its implications. But these are two, colleagues. So he says, Ra'isi Mayan Hamiskaber, Oker Harim Umashaber, Hamazbir Seber, Bumashbir Shever. Beautiful, Ushmo Rabbi Vigdor, Akoin, Sheyechia. Like, it doesn't just say, to whom it may concern. It's like, to my good, respected colleague, who, was
Who I'm
created.
trying to now destroy.
I want to beat
Exactly.
him. I want to
But then
beat
he
him in
said, by the
tennis.
way, Rabbi Vigdor wrote, there were two letters exchanged here. It's just a fascinating thing. And this is a Koslev. It became known, this argument, although for centuries, people didn't know that the Or Zarua was the other letter. We know that now because we have the you'll see later on, the Shach actually says he was confused. People thought that this is the text of the Or Zarua was originally thought to be the work of the Marik, because it's quoted in the Marik. Marik is a 17th century, Italy, person, not a 13th century, Ashkenaz person. So, and then the Shach says, everybody's making a mistake. It's a contemporary of Rabbi Vigdor. He also didn't know it was the Or Zarua. But anyway, there were two exchanges, two letters. So he says, Asisi Kasher Tzivisani. Rabbi Vigdor solicited the opinion of the Or Zarua. He says, I did what you asked. Visponanti b'dvarecha, and I contemplated your tshuva that you wrote. Umitivuscha v'lo minizizuscha echtov miudaiti pam shenit alamaisa asher kasavta b'fanenu chasum. Now here you have names, okay? Like if you want to look these people up, on the internet, you're not going to find them. But Baruch Bar Hoshia. This is what the Shtar says. These have names. Baruch Bar Hoshia. The Amar Kidashti is Blenda Bas Dodi Rabazaria. I guess they're even relatives. These people hated each other. So Baruch Bar Hoshia wants to be Mekadesh Blenda, right? The daughter of Uncle Azaria. You don't make up names, in a fake case. The Hevi Shtar Echad Lefanenu, V'chasumim Shnayim Alav, V'zel Shona Shtar B'fanenu, Chasumim Mata. You want to know what day they got married? This marriage supposedly took place? B'shishi b'Shabbos, like in Anatevka. My mother-in-law always said that in Shtetl, they always used to get married on, I guess it's known, Erev Shabbos. That way the wedding, could dovetail with Shabbos meal. They could save a lot on the expenses. That's consistent with what happened in Anatevka, right? Yeah. So B'shishi b'Shabbos b'shishi yomim liyarech Kislev. You can mark it in your calendar if you want to, send an anniversary present. So Friday, the 6th day of Kislev, Shnas Chameshes Alafim Librias Olam. Unless you think that's too much of a coincidence, but that would make this the year 1240. Right? Kidesh Baruch Bar Hoshias Maras Blenda Bas Rabazaria Bedalet Tapuchim Gedolim. There's a lot of detail here. Okay. The Kachamar Lefanenu. Tirtzali Iskadishli, please accept my Kiddushin. The Elo Tapuchim Gedolim. The Ilu Yio Ha'edim V'Amr Lahain, she says in the presence of witnesses, I'm interested. Ani Rotza Liskadish Lecha, Belo Tapuchim. He gives it to her. Now we have the names of the Edom: Eliah bar Yosef and Moshe bar Yisrael. Ad kan l'shon hashtar. Now the problem is we don't know if it's a forgery or if this is real. The Achar Shavua, Chazar Baruch Haniskar, the husband, Baruch, the so-called husband, a week later, he comes and he says the whole thing's a fraud. The Hoda B'fnei HaKol, he had an attack of conscience. Kikol Masha Amar Shekeru, Pashtara Nizkar, U Plaster Gomor. Plaster means forgery. It's a piece of paper. Kimi Olam Lo Kidsha, his Minatzuli Shaba. He says his father put him up to the whole thing. Al-Kain Nira Bi'atzmo Ki Ein Makom Lishayin Alav Ba'odamar Baruch Bar Hoshia Ki Me'olam Lo Amar Lichtov Shtarzel Aviv Nesanolo. His father pressured him. Kach Kasu V'Chasam Alav Elisha the Gam Aviv Amar Chen. Bi'alachasam Hasheni Amar Baruch Haniskar Shehiski Koso Lachtom Sheker V'Kasa B'Chasumim Bo Lefanenu. The Edom themselves supposedly came. The Sha'alnu as PM al Chasimas Shmosim Shabbat. We said, is this your signature? Aid X and Aid Y, whose names appear in the ink on the document. Imuk ksav yadam v'heim anu v'yamru ein zeh ksav yadenu. That's not our John Hancock. That's not how we sign our name. And we don't know anything about this. Somebody just took our name, put our name on this piece of paper, not us. Ume'olam lo ra'inu shekidsha. We didn't see any kedushin. We weren't asked to sign on any star kedushin. We didn't sign any star kedushin. Va'od his kikanu osam lichtav lefanenu chasimas yadam. Aresh Megilda v'kafnu lechasimas shema. Then they tested their signatures. They said, do me a favor, signs for us. They got the handwriting experts. They said it's not even close. Right? Rabbi Zarya Amar, Kibito and Niskeres, Omer Shalom Niskat Shalom Yolam Lebarak Niskar. Meanwhile, the daughter, the girl, she says, I don't even know who these people are. The Gamachre Kain Sha'alnu is Pia Isha Atzma, the Amr Shalom Kitcha Baruch Me'olam. The Od Gazru Bezdin be Prague, Ube Mantua, Ube Verona, right? Al Kolish ben Karav Le'eda Machsumin ben Rachok, Hamakir Chasimas Ashtar. They put out the word. They said, anybody who knows these signatures in Verona and Prague and Mantua, right? Lo nimsa makir lechasimas halalu. Ach achiv shalali shalavado. Only one guy is claiming that this whole thing is still true. Shehu makira shi chasimasa. Kol shadavar harbe darashin of chakarnu. We really investigated this thoroughly. V'lo matzani lechasimas halal makirim, lo be Prague, lo be Mantua, lo be Verona, lo be Sibdid. I'm not sure what that is. Ach achiv shalali shalavad. Uheid al chasimas achiv ein acher ito ad kam l'shoncha. So the Rabbi Vigdor said, you're wasting your time with all this. It's a fraud. But then he went further. You're right. You're totally right. He didn't just say it's a fraud in this case. He said, anytime one of the protagonists, the Baal, is ma'arer, not this crazy case. Stop. Reish Lakish said, Reish Lakish said, right, Kiyum Shtaros is Drabanan. What he meant was, says Rabbi Vigdor, what he meant was default, if you want to move forward, as long as there's no noise, as long as there's no appeal, as long as there's no controversy, you don't need any further evidence than the piece of paper. Because L'chatza finish L'zufe, and the need for Kiyum Shtaros is only Drabanan, and Mishum Aguna, Ikilu, etc. However, says Rabbi Vigdor, if there's controversy, then even Minat Torah, you can't just rely on a piece of paper and assume that it's authentic. And what does controversy mean? One of two things. Either the Baal is ma'arer, he after all is the other protagonist. We can't just dismiss his claim. Or if the Edom themselves come to court and they say, listen, this document says that we signed, but we didn't. Either of those two scenarios, Rabbi Vigdor says, there's no Reish Lakish. But the Or Zarua says, now look at the Or Zarua. Hineni kosev lekvodcha ki kain daiti, kasher kosapti elecha b'ksav rishon. The Or Zarua says, I don't think you're right. I mean, he thinks he's right in this case, technically, but he thinks that anytime there is a shtar, there's a default Reish Lakish, even if the Baal is ma'arer, even if the Edom themselves disassociate. She'ein klal koach biyad bezdin lepotra below get. And therefore, formally, she needs a get. Where does this come from? From our Gemara in Gittin. The Amaresh Parakama de Gittin, Ulravad Amar Levi Shein Edom Mitzuyim Lekaimo, Liboy Trey, shouldn't you need two witnesses? Shaninam Bidinu de Kiyim Shtaros Namil Liboy Kidaresh Lakish. Actually, Minat Torah, you don't need ever to verify a document because of Reish Lakish. The Amaresh Lakish, Edom Aksum Malashtar, Nasa Kemish and Echra Dusim Bebezdin. The signatures on a document are projected to be authentic evidence that was interrogated and found valid. For Rabbanan u'da'atzrich, it's only a rabbinic requirement. B'achem shemaginu akil Rabbanan b'tiru b'dechad. Shaminan mehacha, says the Or Zarua. Kol heicha d'chsimi sadi b'shtara. Anytime you see a signed contract, i'asi hayu ma'arer if the other party comes to court and appeals, the Amar lo ayudvarim miolam and says, I didn't, this is a fraud, lo mashgicham be midivrei Torah klal. The Shtar, Reish Lakish protects itself. This is the Arzarua arguing against Rabbi Victor Cohen and the Rambam, who say, well, if there's an actual challenge, then you need to authenticate. Again, the challenge doesn't destroy the shtar. The challenge determines that you have to authenticate the shtar. But the Arzarua says, Minat Torah, that's not true. The authentication of a shtar is always D'Rabbanan. Afal gav dekaim becheskas ish sharinan lehinase el da'achmor Rabbanan. When you have a get,
According to the Arzarua, there's no situation.
nonetheless, she can get married even if the Baal is Minat Torah. Midrabanan, we're more machmir. But Minat Torah, the get would protect itself even from an Ir Rabal, even from an Ir Ha'ed. Now, the halacha, as I say, this was a cause select. This, exchange was. So if you look in the halacha, maybe I'll do this for next time because it's so important. This is like a very foundational argument.
Here we have the flip. It's the kedushin that we're trying to work with, not the get.
Yeah. But it's the same principle, except that as the Baruch points out, in a get, if you're machmir, it means that you can't do anything until you go further. In kiddushin, right? She needs a get.
She's making her an Eshes Ish.
Right. Meaning they're on opposite sides of it. It's the same legal issue, but the consequences are opposite. So if we're even
Arzarua sees no situation where you can invalidate,
except if you have other Eidim who come to court and directly testify. But if it's the Ira Rabal or
other Eidim or the people who supposedly signed, who has to come? What's the litmus test for those Arzarua to invalidate the get?
Oh, so let me tell you one other thing. Let me just tell you one other thing because we're going to have to stop in a second anyway. So in the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Mem Vav, Sif Daled, the Sma in Choshen Mishpat paskins like Rabbi Vigdor. Okay, he says, I paskin like Rabbi Vigdor.
That's only a default position. No, if there's no objection.
Correct. The Shach in Siman Mem Vav Sif Katan Tes says, why is he passing like Rabbi Vigdor? You know why? Because he thought that the opposition to Rabbi Vigdor was 300 years later in the Marik. But if he reads carefully, it's a contemporary of Rabbi Vigdor. He didn't know it was the Arzarua. He said, I think the Arzarua is right. But one caveat. He says, I think that maybe Rabbi Vigdor's right when the Eidim themselves come to court and they say it wasn't us. That would be Kim Shtaros Deraisa. If it's only the Baal who's Ma'arer, then we're going with the Arzarua. See, David, that's your, right? Meaning he compromises. The Shach.
Reasoning is that he's a Baal Dover. What's the reasoning?
What do you mean?
Why is the Baal not strong enough? Because he's one person?
Yeah. He's one person, and he's not the Eidim.
He has no relationship to the document.
What?
He has
He has a very strong relationship to the document.
Yeah.
Right. No, he has a very strong relationship to the document.
He does, but
there can't be any document. It has to be Lishma. He has to tell the Sofer to write it.
No, he does have a strong relationship with the document, but you can't compare his
testimony to
his disassociation from the Eidim who themselves say we never saw this.
What I'm trying to understand is he's a Nogeh B'Dover or he's only one aid? What's the problem?
No, neither.
I think it's neither. I think it's I think it's the other way. I think the two Eidim who themselves were really focused on these two Eidim and whether or not they really signed this document or not.
Well, that's what I mean.
Therefore they themselves, if they themselves are denying it, then that's too much.
But that might be
I think anything less than that, which includes the Baal for various reasons, is not going to be enough. Yeah, sorry.
No, I'm saying maybe that's in the direction of Nogea B'Dover, because their relation, let me put it the other way, their relationship is only to the document.
Right.
As opposed to the Baldover who has
His divorce.
who is affected by it, but by its meaning, because whatever. So
Right. I don't think it's because of Negius per se. I think it's
no, I'm just saying, but it leans in that direction, is what may be.
So the Shach ends up making that distinction between the two Eidim themselves who disassociate and the Baal. But the Sma says even the Baal, and others say even the two Eidim are not going to be good enough. So you have this range, but they're always all the subsequent literature on this topic, and you can see it's a very critical topic, obviously. All subsequent literature on this topic makes mention, without the colorful details, because you have to read the originals, inside to really understand what's going on. They just, they crystallize the legal, they distilled the legal conclusions from it. That's what they really cared about. But the truth is, the case is insightful, in addition to being historically interesting, because this is where a lot of it got played out. But what's even more is that the Orzarua required a get, even in a case like this, where on a practical level, he knew it was a fraud too. But what he was saying was, lo plug, listen, Reish Lakish is such a cornerstone idea, that the contract, is default midoraisa authentic, that even in a case where for particular reasons we know it isn't true, you're still going to need a get because legally it's true. It's almost like you were saying before, but you were saying it, lakula, but sometimes you do the law is the law and it creates its own reality. Here the law creates its own reality, but in the other direction, in the direction of.
But it is interesting that we haven't had a case with detail like it since how many years now? 7.
Well, no, I'm sure there are many other cases, but this.
Well, show them.
But you will not find, when you look at the history of this topic, anything after this where this was known, this is like the first case, just like in law, it's you always quote I'm not a lawyer, but you quote the famous
right, of course.
Precedents. This is the precedent, this case, the Rabbi Vigdor and the Orzarua. Then comes the Sma, then the Marik and the Sma and the Shach, and of course there are many other, and of course the Rambam is part of this mix. Not because he had nothing to do with this case, but it's the same issue, basically. This is the case law that you're quoting.
But just halachically in process.
But 1 second, the origin of the case law is Argamar and Gittin.
Right, but just halachically in terms of process, were it to have not been contemporaneous arguments, we found this out later. Does that make any difference or not?
So that's an interesting, meaning the Shach,
right,
was claiming the Shach, meaning legally it really shouldn't. Of course, when you have a close, you have authority figures or the arguments are roughly whatever, so then the idea of, going to the greater stature, and in religious matters, sometimes, so like an earlier.
No, I'm talking about I'm assuming that if you could equate their significance as Talmud Chacham,
right.
Would it make a difference?
So the only difference it might make, the way that some of them say it is, this is if the later people said X, Y, and Z, if they had known that there was like an earlier authority on the other side, that might have affected, their thinking or their interest in turning over every option, in this case. It's more like a psychological, comment. Just that the Shach says, they were all wrong anyway. They thought that they just didn't realize that it was a contemporary and whatever. So the law, in a substantive way, it shouldn't matter at all.
Well, but maybe their motivation, if they thought that they were coming up with it now 300 years later, is not suspect, but they were taking what they thought might be a radical view. Compared to
there was a precedent, and it was like this.
Right, they didn't know that there was an argument before that was contemporaneous.
This was a law accepted like a consensus for 300 years.
Yeah, maybe they wouldn't have been, again, it's a psychological question, not a
it's not either way. It's the arguments really, because again, what's fascinating about all this is the arguments go back to the ambiguity in our Gemara. Meaning, there is a case missing. We know that the Gemara is saying Reish Lakish, moving forward, but we don't know what happens if and we know that we're trying to preclude any kind of an appeal. We just don't know what happens if we don't succeed. Then there actually is an appeal, despite the despite the Kiyum Shtaros D'Rabbanan. What happens then? That's the missing case, and it's that missing case, which ends up being the crucial.
So maybe Rabbi Vigdor and the Ozarus camaraderie relates to the fact that they have this juicy case that they can now opine.
He wrote to him. He wrote to him, and he's, the poetry was before he got the answer back.
Well, that's why he was so poetic. He said, "Look what we got here. We can."
But they're conjoined, forever now.
Exactly. It's
So maybe the word, maybe Blenda and Baruch's, almost wedding, had a purpose in that respect too.
Right.
But
Right.
I think it's a very fascinating chapter.
You know what? The more I think about it, it is a real case.
Because you couldn't create such a case in your mind.
It's what Alan said. It's truth is stranger than fiction. That's
Right.
basically.
Truth is right. The only thing that's suspicious about the case, I have all the dates and the thing. The only suspicious a little is the date, that it's exactly, that it's exactly.
Well, the cases might have been accurate.
That
might have been a little. That might have been a little embroidery or icing on the cake.
Although 1240, it's a little bit. That part is a little whatever, but okay. Yeah. Anyways,
thank you, Yashko.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Just one last question. Perhaps we can pick it up on the next sure. And that is, there seems to have been on the part of the debater, so to speak, that they thought that they're either contemporary or not contemporary. And so obviously that affects their opinion. My question in general, across the Gemara, I gather there are several cases indeed where people were mistaken in terms of when a particular fact materialized or whatever, or opinion or whatever it might be. How basically is this resolved in the absence of, here we know who the players were and when they lived, but what about situations where we don't have forensic information to determine when and where the commentators are.
Right. It's a good question.
Because I just wonder in general, how many other cases where actually we didn't find out that that person lived in a particular era and so on and so forth, and how that basically shapes the psak. Because what I heard is that the psak was finally shaped because it was Avigdor and so on.
I don't want to overstate that. What I'm saying is this: in this case, you have a lot of specificity, and that's unusual.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like we were saying before. In the end of the day, the bigger question is the substantive, quality of the claims back and forth. This is about understanding the law, and and applying, the principles and the known precedents, to cases that come up. And I think in most cases it isn't so important, to know exactly who the people were, or it can always shed an extra light maybe, but in most cases it's the legal principles and the parameters of applying them are far more important than.
Well, precisely. So why did he invoke the fact that it was Rav Avigdor?
No. He was just saying, they're just, these two contemporaries were arguing about this case. And, we know, they were colleagues and they had mutual respect. And even though they were, vociferously disagreeing with each other, the etiquette of debate, which I think is very important, frankly. I think, if the Republicans and the Democrats, were addressing themselves strongly, but with a little bit of poetry in the beginning. I think probably the country would be moving, forward better, and there would be less rancor. So I think it's important that each person respected the other, even though they held strongly, different, views. And it's an interesting phenomenon. That's all.
But Rabbi, the truth, since it's all about the pursuit of truth.
Yeah.
And there's no absolute truth. We know that. I remember someone saying the only truth is the alphabet. Is aleph is an aleph and a base is a base. So the question is we are in pursuit of the truth. Why then should that depend on the person?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, except that, think about it this way. If you're debating with somebody who you respect, that you're not less committed to finding the truth, but you might be more open-minded to hearing, his version of it. And that probably makes your either disagreement or your acquiescence, as the case may be, more powerful too. You know what I'm saying? And
The
I
abstract-
think
the abstract
really,
concept-
again, I don't
the
want to
abstract-
get into what's that?
So the abstract concepts are richer when you have a real case to
Right.
apply it to.
Right. First of all, there's also consequences and pressure, because you need to also resolve these people's situation.
It's real life. It's real life.
It's life. But in addition to that, what I'm saying, and Tom, you're asking me more about the, the fact that each one's saying about the other, that they're, what does that have to do with truth? But I do think, I'll give you one example. I've spoken about this before, but I think it's really important, and especially in our climate. I just don't want to speak too much about it. That, the Gemara says in Eruvin that, in the debates between Hillel and Shammai, the two schools, they were very fierce rivals. But the Gemara says that, we usually paskin like Hillel over Shammai. And the reason for that, one of the reasons is because their etiquette of debate was more impressive. They would always quote, they would say, when people would ask them the law, they'd say, listen, this is what our colleagues in Beis Shammai think this, but we disagree. And they would always mention Beis Shammai's view first, and they would mention that there was another view, and then they would strongly state their view. And that's one of the reasons that we pass. So the question is, what does that even mean? It's not etiquette. We're not talking about good man. They should get the Good Manners Award. They should, as you say, we're pursuing truth.
Exactly.
Yeah. So my answer is, and I found this subsequently, most 80% of it or 90% of it in the Maharal, who says the same thing, which is what I was saying to you before, which is, yeah, of course, etiquette is etiquette, and law and arguments and truth is truth. However, when somebody is respectful of someone else's opinion, then his conclusion, not to accept it, is actually a more impressive conclusion, because at least you're weighing it and you're hearing it, and then you're making an informed decision. So if my ego is in the way, and I'm not saying Shammai's ego is in the way, but let's say Hillel bent over backwards, to be respectful of Shammai's positions, and and Afal Pichein, they came to a different conclusion, and therefore the different conclusion in a way is more impressive, because it reflects, having deliberated, even more seriously and weighed that option, and therefore their continued disagreement is more impressive. Whereas if somebody doesn't respect their, debate partner, and they're not really listening to them, so they might be a better debater, but their position, they lose something. They lose in the opportunity to really core, reassess, their position. So it's not etiquette.
No, it's
providing substance.
Humility
It's etiquette that contributes to a higher standard, in argumentation, and how compelling you feel your own argument is.
So it basically comes down to, from what I understand, Rabbi, and I very much appreciate your explanation, because it's a fascinating insight as, the debate between Hillel and Shammai, is that because Hillel was willing to listen, to understand what Shammai said, and respectfully disagree, saying, I take all the arguments and so on, but respectfully, I have to disagree. Like you say often in court or wherever it might be, or a colleague or whatever, you say respectfully.
Or you're not just saying it, you're meaning it.
Because the reality is, who actually owns the truth
Right.
at the end of the day? We
Right.
really don't know.
Well, we try our best. We try to
No,
approximate.
indeed. So I gather etiquette does come into it, so that I gather Shammai didn't feel so bad when Hillel said, "Well, basically, I disagree with you, but I listened
Right.
to you." I think
The
there's
point
nothing
is,
worse
it's a
than people not being
stronger,
heard.
it strengthens his argument if he's given more, more reverence
Yeah, yeah.
to the opposing view. And again, I think we live in a world right now where everybody's trying to shout each other down and, make these kind of, what do they call it? Gotcha, kind of points. And it's sad. I don't think it's the first time we've been in this kind of a society. I mean, frankly, it's happened many times before. It wasn't invented now, but we're living through a period in which this is very, very much the norm. And I think we're all, impoverished by that.
Well, at least there's a debate. There are other countries that will
No,
remain.
100%. 100%.
There's no debate.
Yeah,
So-
no, you can't compare.
And if anyone speaks up, they get thrown in prison, or they get thrown out a window. So you can
And we should be grateful for that. But
very
we could still do better. So, within that, we could do better.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi. That was
Thank you,
very-
Rabbi.
Good
Show
evening.
very insightful. Thank you.
And
Appreciate it.
good to see you all. And I think I have a wedding on Lag BaOmer night. I think that is
Right,
that
but
2 weeks
next week is regular, and then you'll update.
next
on-
week is regular. yeah.
Right, and then you'll tell us the schedule, okay?
So does a Lag BaOmer merit a Cupid's bow and arrow? A wedding on Lag BaOmer?
That's a great point. I have to give that some thought. I don't want to give it too quick an answer. I want to show respect for the suggestion.
All
Have a
right,
good
thank you,
evening.
Rabbi. Yeshua.
Thank you, good night, good night.
Hi, thank you.